ओम ज्ञानतिमिरान्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। श्रीचैतन्यमनोभीष्टं स्थापितं येन भूतले स्वयं रूपकथामहिं ददति स्वपदान्तिकं वन्देऽहं श्रीगुरु श्रीयुतपदकमलान् श्रीगुरु वैष्णवांश्च श्रीरूपं साग्रजातं सहगणरघुनाथान्वितां तं सजीवं साद्वैतं सावधूतं परिजनसहितं कृष्णचैतन्यदेवं श्रीराधाकृष्णपादान् सहगणललित श्री विशाख अन्वितांश्च ओम विष्णुपादाय कृष्णप्रस्थाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदांत स्वामिनिति नामिने नमस्ते सारस्वते देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्य देशतारिणे वंचाकल्पतरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्त वृंद। हरे कृष्ण। Evening. Okay. Hare Krishna.
8 o'clock uses the
Fine. We'll talk. Okay. Reading from Śrīla Prabhupāda-līlāmṛta, Volume 1, Chapter 21. Beyond the lower east side. But we were shocked that he was going to leave. Every attend. But we were shocked that he was going to leave. I never thought that Krishna consciousness would go beyond the lower east side. What to speak of New York City? I thought that this is what it was. Was it, and it would stay here eternally. Brahmananda. Hare Krishna was becoming popular. Regular kirtans in the park, newspaper coverage. Hayagriva called it the Hare Krishna explosion. The lower east side hippies considered the chanting of the Hare Krishna one of the grooviest thing happening, and that the Swami's disciples didn't take LSD didn't seem to affect their popularity. The devotees were accepted as angelic people, carrying the peaceful chanting to others and offering free food and a free place to stay. You could get the most interesting vegetarian food free at their place if you went at the right time. And in their storefront, on the shelf by the door, were books from India. In the clubs, local musicians played the melody that they had picked up from the Swami when he chanted in the park and at the temple. The Lower East Side was a neighborhood of artists and musicians, and now it was also the neighborhood of Hare Krishna. Burton Green. Musicians were influenced by it. The Krishna chanting, Govinda Jaya Jaya, and other chants. I used some of those chants when I recorded. A lot of musicians reached out for this in different ways. We would explode in a short time and blow off, but then keep the chant underneath as a basis. A lot of people found that spiritual vibration even in the midst of heavy music they were doing. They were becoming devotee musicians. Evening kirtans were always big. Brahmananda used to stand by the back door every night and watch the room fill up until there was no place left to sit. There was a lot of interest in the group chanting and music making, but after the kirtan, when the talk was to begin, people would start to leave. It was not uncommon for half the audience to leave before the talk began, and sometimes people would leave in the middle of the lecture. One evening, Allen Ginsberg brought Ed Sanders and Tuli Kupferberg of the Fugs to the meeting. The Fugs, a local group that had made a name for themselves, specialized in obscene lyrics. Among the popular songs of Ed Sanders were Slum Goddess of Lower East Side, Group Grope, and I Can't Get High. Ed had wild red hair and an electric red beard, and he played a guitar during the kirtan. The devotees were happy to see their prestigious guests. The night of the fugs, however, Prabhupada chose to speak on the illusion of sex pleasure. Sex pleasure binds us to this material world birth after birth, he said. And he quoted, as he often did, a verse of Yamunacharya: Since I have become Krishna conscious, whenever I think of sex life with a woman, my face at once turns from it and I spit at that thought. The fug, the fugs never returned. To speak ill of sex pleasure was certainly not a strategic move for one who wanted to create followers among the lower East hippies. But Prabhupada never considered changing his message. In fact, when Umapati had mentioned that Americans didn't like to hear that sex was only for conceiving children, Prabhupada had replied, I cannot change the philosophy to please the Americans. What about sex? Asked the ISKCON attorney Steve Goldsmith one evening, speaking out from the rear of crowded temple. Sex should only be with one's wife, Prabhupada said, and that is also restricted. Sex is for propagation of Krishna conscious children. My spiritual master used to say that to beget Krishna conscious children, he was prepared to have sex 100 times. Of course, that is most difficult in this age. Therefore, he remained a brahmachari. But sex is a very strong force, Mr. Goldsmith challenged. What a man feels for a woman is undeniable. Therefore, in every culture, there is the institution of marriage. Prabhupada replied. You can get yourself married and live peacefully with one woman, but the wife should not be used as a machine for sense gratification. Sex should be restricted to only once a month and only for the propagation of children. Haigriva, who was seated just to Swamiji's left beside the large dangling chimbal, spoke out suddenly. Only once a month? And with a touch of facetious humor, he added loudly, better to forget the whole thing. Yes, that's it. Very good boy. Swamiji laughed and others joined him. It is best not to think of it. Best just to chant Hare Krishna. And he held up his hands as if he were chanting on a stand of beads. That way we will be saved from so many botherations. Sex is like the itching sensation, that's all. And as when we scratch, it gets worse. So we should tolerate the itching and ask Krishna to help us. It is not easy. Sex is the highest pleasure in the material world, and it is also the greatest bondage. But Steve Goldsmith was shaking his head. Prabhupada looked at him, smiling. There is still a problem? It's just that, well, it's been proved dangerous to repress the sex drive. There's a theory that we have wars before because people are eating meat. Prabhupada interrupted. As long as people eat meat, there will be war. And if a man eats meat, he will be sure to have illicit sex also. Steve Goldsmith was an influential friend and supporter of ISKCON, but Prabhupada would not change the philosophy of Krishna consciousness to please the Americans. Judson Hall on West 57th Street cost $200 to rent for one night. Raya Rama thought it was time Swamiji tried reaching some of the most sophisticated New Yorkers. And since Judson Hall was near Carnegie Hall and sometimes had interesting concerts and lectures, he thought it would be a good place to start. Swamiji agreed to the idea, and Raya Rama printed an announcement which he distributed in midtown bookstores. On the night of the event, the devotees paraded through the midtown entertainment areas, beating a bass drum and handing out leaflets. Then they returned to Judson Hall for the program. Only 7 people attended. The devotees felt terrible. They had misled Swamiji and spoke the equivalent of a month's rent. We can cancel the program if you like, Swamiji, Raya Ram said. But Prabhupada replied, no, let us chant and speak. So the devotees took the stage and chanted with Swamiji and danced, and then sat beside him as he lectured, his voice echoing through the empty hall. Afterward, Swamiji called for questions, and a young man, about 15 vacant rows back, asked whether it was correct in understanding that the Swami's philosophy was primarily for reforming destitute young people? No, Prabhupada replied. Everyone in this material world is lost and destitute, even the so-called successful person, because everyone has forgotten Krishna. After the program, Swamiji sat in a chair by the exit as the few members of audience were leaving. A respectable-looking couple introduced themselves, and Swamiji sat very straight with folded palms and smiled. Brahmananda's mother was present, and the Swamiji was very cordial toward her. But in general, the devotees were depressed at the same turnout. I am sorry, Swamiji, we invited you here and almost no one came. Raya Rama apologized. But Prabhupada raised his eyebrows and said, no one? You did not see Narada? You did not see Lord Brahma? When do the demigods come to participate? Back at the temple, Prabhupada cheated Raya Ram. I told you we should have charged money. When something is charged $3 or $5 and people will think, oh, you're offering some very valuable thing. In Bengal, there is story of a man who went house to house offering free mangoes, and no one would take his mangoes because everyone thought, oh, he, why is he giving away these mangoes? There must be something wrong with them. So he charged 3 rupees, and then they thought, these look like good mangoes. The price is only 3 rupees. All right. So when people see that something is free, they think it is worthless. Charge them some money and they will think it is very nice. Burton Green was a musician, fond of the Swami and fond of banging on the innards of the piano in the temple during Kirtan. Burton Green. We had a really explosive thing to break out of with this capitalistic, materialistic egg sitting on us. So there was so much ferocity in the music to break out of. But spinning out like that, you could have a nervous breakdown. So it was great to go to the Swami's and chant in his small storefront on Second Avenue. The streets were full of Maya and perversion, and his was a place of really mellow out. It was great to chant there to balance my life. It was great to sit and have prasadam with the Swami and get some real authentic Indian cooking and chapatis and talk about things. Especially when I had nice to go. When I attend his piano recital at the theater, Prabhupada agreed. Brahmananda. After about 7 or 8 of us in our sneakers and jeans had ridden on the subway with Swamiji to town hall. We went in and took our seats and the concert began. Hutton Green came out, opened the piano top, took a hammer and began wildly hitting on the strings inside the piano. And it went on for an hour and a half. We were all sitting there with Swamiji and we all began chanting on our beats. There were only about 2 dozen people in the whole theater. Then the interruption came and Swamiji wanted to go to the toilet room and I went along with him along and helped him, turning on the water in the sink, getting a paper towel for him. Doing these little services for Swamiji seemed like the perfection of my life. There was something so great about him that just doing those things was my perfection. And I felt like I was protecting him, like I was his personal bodyguard. Coming up on the subway, I had shown him how the subway worked and answered his questions. It all seemed very intimate. Anyway, we went back upstairs to our seats, and Burton Green came right up to Swamiji's saying, Swamiji, are you happy? Are you comfortable? Do you like it? And Swamiji was very polite and said, yes. Then Burton said, now the second part is coming. I interrupted and tried to say that Swamiji is very tired and he takes rest at 10. It was already after 10. So I said we had to go back, but he pressed Swamiji to stay for second half, and so we had to stay. Then the poets came out and recited poetry. We were there until 11:30, and then we had to ride back on the subway. But a few weeks later, I learned that Prabhupada had another reason for going to town hall. He was thinking of renting it for a temple, and he wanted to see it. The Gate Theatre was a small auditorium on 2nd Avenue, about 10 blocks north of the storefront. Satsvarupa. We rented the Gate Theatre for one night. It was dark place, painted all black. The theater was almost empty. He had an easel on stage with a painting of Panchatattva. Swamiji spoke, and his talk became very technical, pointing and referring back to the painting. He described each member of Panchatattva. He first explained that Lord Chaitanya is the supreme personality of Godhead appearing as a pure devotee. Lord Nityananda, to the right of Lord Chaitanya, is his first expansion, and to the right of Lord Nityananda is Advaita, who is the incarnation of the Supreme Lord. To the left of Lord Chaitanya, he said, is Gadadhar, and the internal energy, and Srivas is the perfect devotee. During the talk, I was thinking that this was maybe too elevated for audience, but I was sitting close beside Swamiji, and like the other devotees, I was really enjoying being with him. After the Gate engagement, Swamiji and his disciples agreed that it was a waste of time trying to rent theaters. It was better to go to Tompkins Square Park. That was the best place for attracting people, and it didn't cost anything. It was 11 a.m. and only one light was on in Swamiji's apartment. In the kitchenette, Swamiji was staying up teaching Kirtanananda and Brahmananda how to cook, because the next day, Sunday, they would be holding a feast for the public. Kirtanananda had suggested it to be advertised as a love feast, and Swamiji had adopted the name, although some thought it sounded strange at first to hear him say love feast. The devotees had put up posters around the neighborhood and had made a sign of for the window of the storefront. And Swamiji had said he would cook enough for at least 50 people. He said the love feast should become an important part of ISKCON. As he had explained many times, food offered to Krishna becomes spiritual, and whoever eats the prasadam receives great spiritual benefits. Prasadam means mercy. His two helpers stood respectfully beside him, sometimes stepping back out of his way as he moved, and sometimes looking over his shoulder as he mixed spices or set a pan over the flame or called for another ingredient. He was stirring a big pot of sweet rice with a wooden spoon. It had to be stirred constantly and slowly adding milk. If the sweet rice burned, it would be ruined, he said, and he handed the spoon to Kirtanananda. He next showed them how to make ghee by heating butter in a wok and separating the milk solids from the butter fat. And he simultaneously taught them how to make apple chutney. Prabhupada was silent as he cooked, but when Brahmananda asked him how he had learned so much about cooking, Prabhupada said that he had learned by watching his mother. He laughed and said it had not been like it is in the West, where you take a lump of flesh from your refrigerator, throw it in a pan, boil it, sprinkle it with salt, and then eat like an animal. And in Korea, he said they eat dogs, but human beings should eat grains, fruits, vegetables, and milk, and the cow especially should not be killed. While Brahmananda cut the apples for the chutney and put them in pot for steaming, and Kirtananda stirred the sweet rice, Swamiji prepared masala, the basic mixture of spices which he would soon add to the steaming apples. The familiar smell of red pepper and cumin seeds entered their nostrils sharply as the masala crackled and smoked in the hot ghee in the tiny frying pan. With three separate operations going at once, sweet rice, steaming apples, and masala, Prabhupada cautioned Kirtananda to stir the sweet rice steadily and scrape the bottom of the pot, and he took the spoon for a moment from Kirtananda's hand and demonstrated how to stir it properly. Sweet rice chutney and certain other dishes could be made in advance for the feast, he explained, but many things would have to be done the next morning. Prabhupada rose early, despite having kept late hours the night before, and after the morning class, he was back in the kitchen. Now, half a dozen disciples sat in his front room making dough for puris and samosas. He had shown them how to make the dough, and Umapati had kneaded for a while by pounding the soft dough with his fists. But Brahmananda was better at it, soaking, sorry, huh? Soaking the weight of his wrestler's body onto the large lump of dough. As Swamiji entered the room to examine the quality of the puris, his disciples looked upon at him respectfully. They were always serious when he was present. He picked up a puri and examined it. It is not to the standard, he said, but it will have to, but it will have to do. Then, amid crumpled rejects and oddly shaped pieces of dough, he squatted down beside his helpers, who were trying as best they could, though making a mess. He took a small ball of dough, pressed it flat with his fingers, and then deftly rolled it out until it curled around the wooden pin and then fell off a perfectly round puri. He held it up, displaying a translucent, thin, but not too thin, patty of dough. Make them like this, he said. But hurry. On discovering that the dough was too stiff, Swamiji added a little ghee and then a little milk and kneaded the dough to a softer texture. Everything should be just right, he said, and his disciples took to their menial tasks with concentrated earnestness. Who among them had ever heard of these things before? Puris and samosas. It was all new, and the challenge something very important. It was a part of devotional service. Swamiji did much of the cooking as he simultaneously supervised his helpers. He was always near, walking barefoot back to the kitchen, then to the front room, then to his own room in the near. And even when he went to his back room, his disciples could see him through the window in the wall. Swamiji saw each of the nearly 1 dozen dishes through its final stages, and his disciples carried them into the front room in pots, one by one, and placed them before the picture of Lord Chaitanya. There was halwa, dal, two sabjis, fancy rice, puri, samosa, sweet rice, apple chutney, and gulab jamuns, or sweet balls, iskon bullets. Prabhupada had personally spent much time slowly deep frying the sweet balls on a low heat until they had turned golden brown and full. Then, one by one, he had lifted them out of the ghee with a slotted spoon and put them to soak in sugar syrup. He recognized that these golden ghee fried milk balls soaked with sugar water were his disciples' favorite prasadam treat. He called them ISKCON bullets because they were weapons in the war against Maya. He even allowed that a jar of ISKCON bullets floating in their syrup he be always on hand in the front room where his disciples could take them without asking permission and without observing any regulated hours. They could take as many as they liked. Kirtanananda brought in the samosa filling, which he has prepared from spinach and green peas cooked to a paste, and which the Swami had heavily spiced. Stuffing the samosas was an art, and Swamiji showed them how to do it. He took a semicircle of a dough, shaped it into a cone, stuffed it with a spoonful of filling, and then folded the top over and sealed it a samosa ready for the hot ghee. Achyutananda carried the imperfectly shaped puris into kitchen where he and Kirtananda deep fried them two at a time. If the temperature of the ghee and the consistency of the dough and the size, shape, and thickness of puri were all just right, the puri would cook in only a few seconds, rising to the surface of the ghee. Where they would inflate like little balloon. The cooks then stood them on edge in a cardboard box to drain off the excess ghee. As they completed the last preparations for the feast, Swamiji's disciples washed the stiff dough from their hands and went down to the storefront where they set out the straw mats and awaited the guests and the feast. Upstairs, Swamiji and a couple of his cooks offered all the preparations to Lord Chaitanya, reciting the Parampara prayer. The first few love feasts were not very well attended, but the devotees were so enthusiastic about the feast prasadam that they showed no disappointment even over the scarcity of the guests. They were prepared to eat everything. Satsvarupa. There was something called Brahmana spaghetti. Brahmana spaghetti, which was rice flour noodles cooked in ghee and soaked in sugar water. And there was halava, pushpana rice with fried cheese balls, samosa, split mung beans fried into crunchy pellets and mixed with salt and spices, puris, gulab jamuns, and everything was succulent. That was the word Hayagriva used. Yes, he would say, expressing it vaguely, everything was very succulent. Eating the feast with an intense experience. We Eating the feast was an intense experience. We were supposed to be subduing our senses all week, following strict regulations, controlling the tongue, and the feast was a kind of reward. Swamiji and Krishna were giving us a taste of full spiritual ecstasy, even though we were still beginners and still in the material world. Before taking my plateful, I would pray, please let me remain in Krishna consciousness because it is so nice and I am so fallen. Let me serve Swamiji and let me now enjoy this feast in transcendental bliss. And I would begin eating, going from one taste sensation to another. The good rice, the favorite vegetable, the bread, and saving the gulab jam for the last, thinking I can have seconds, and if I like thirds. We would keep our eyes on the big pots, confident that there was as much as we wanted. It was a time of rededication. We all enjoyed with completely open relish and sense gratification. Eating was very important. Gradually, attendance picked up. The feasts were free and they were reputed to be delicious. Mostly local hippies came, but occasionally a higher class of experimenting New Yorkers or even the parents of one of the devotees would come. When the small temple was filled, guests would sit in the courtyard. They would take their prasadam, laden paper plates, and their wooden spoons into backyard garden and sit beneath the fire escape or at the picnic table or anywhere. And after eating, they would go back into the storefront for more. Devotees were stationed behind the pots of prasadam, and the guests would come by for seconds. The other tenants were not very happy about seeing the courtyard full of festive guests, and the devotees tried to pacify them by bringing them plates of prasadam. Although Swamiji would not go down to the temple, he would take a plate in his room and hear with pleasure about the success of his new program. One time, the devotees were eating so ravenously that they threatened to eat everything available before the guests had all been served, and Kirtanananda had to admonish them for their selfish attitude. Gradually, they were understanding that the Sunday feast was not just for their fun and pleasure, but to bring people to Krishna consciousness. Prabhupada had begun Back to Godhead magazine in India. Although he had been writing articles since the 1930s, it was 1944 in Calcutta that he had single-handedly begun the magazine in response to his spiritual master's request that he preach Krishna consciousness in English. It had been with great difficulty that through his pharmaceutical business, he had managed to gather 400 rupees a month for printing. And he had single-handedly written, edited, published, financed, and distributed each item. In those early years, Back to Godhead had been Prabhupada's major literary work and preaching mission. He had envisioned widespread distribution of the magazine, and he had thought of plans for spreading the message of Lord Chaitanya all over the world. He had drawn up a list of major countries and the number of copies of Back to Godhead he wanted to send to each. He sought donations for finance this project, but help was scarce. Then in 1959, he had turned his energies towards writing and publishing the Srimad Bhagavatam. But now he wanted to revive back to Godhead, and this time it would not be done single-handedly. This time he would give the responsibility to his disciples. Greg Sharp, now Gargamuni, since his recent initiation, found a press. A country club in Queens was trying to sell its small AB Dick press. Prabhupada was interested and he rode out to Queen in a borrowed van with Gargamuni and Kirtanananda to see the machine. It was old but in good condition. The manager of the country club wanted $250 for it. Prabhupada looked over the machine carefully and talked with the manager, telling him of his spiritual mission. The manager mentioned a second press he had on hand and explained that neither machine was actually of any use to him. So Prabhupada said he would pay 250 for both machines. The country club did not really need them, and besides, the manager should help out since Srila Prabhupada had an important spiritual message to print for the benefit of all humanity. The man agreed. Prabhupada had Gargamuni and Kirtananda load both machines into the van, and ISKCON had its printing press. Srila Prabhupada gave over the editorship of Back to Godhead magazine to Hayagriva and Raya Rama. For so many years, he had taken Back to Godhead as his personal editor. Raya Ram, the professional writer, take up Back to Godhead magazine as their service to their spiritual master. In a short time, Hayagriva and Raya Rama had compiled the first issue and were ready to print. It was an off night, no public kirtan and lecture. And Swamiji was up in his nervously over the machine, examining the printing quality of each page, stroking his beard and murmuring, Now it was time. Lasted for 100 copies and 100 copies of each of 28 pages, and the front and back covers were now lined up along two of the unvarnished that summer. A few days later, another until they reached the end of the bench. Who stood brushing his long hair out of his? Brahmananda had brought from him Board of Education office. Even Hayagriva, who usually didn't volunteer for menial duties, was there, walking down the line, collating. Suddenly, the side door opened, and to their surprise, they saw Swamiji looking in at them. Then he opened the door wide and entered the room. He had never come down like this on an off night before. They felt an unexpected flush of emotion and love for him, and they dropped down on their knees, bowing their heads to the floor. No, no, he said, raising his hand to stop them, as some were still bowing and others already raising to their feet. Continuing Continue what you are doing. When they stood up and saw him standing with them, they weren't sure what to do, but obviously he had come down to see them producing his Back to Godhead magazine. So they continued working silently and effectively. Prabhupada walked down the row of pages, his hand and wrist extending gracefully from the folds of his shawl as he touched a stack of pages, and then a finished magazine, ISKCON Press, he said. Jagannath had designed the cover using a pen and ink drawing of Radha and Krishna, similar to his painting in the temple. It was a simple drawing set within a pattern of concentric circles. The first page opened with the same motto Prabhupada had used for years on his Back to Godhead. Back to light, nescience is darkness. Where there is Godhead, there is no nescience. And On the same page, Hayagriva had not been able to resist giving a quotation from William Blake, approved by Swamiji, which substantiated the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in the night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. Although the editorial spoke of Blake Whiteman and Jesus Christ, its test, it is to teach this science of devotion to God that Swami Bhaktivedanta has come to America. His message is simple: the chanting of the holy name of God. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare. Following the orders of his spiritual master, His Divine Grace Srimad Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada, Swami Bhaktivedanta began the initial publication of Back to Godhead in 1944. This bi-weekly, published from 1944 to 1956 in Vrindavan, India, established Swami Bhaktivedanta as a leading personalist in India. This issue marks the first publication of Back to Godhead in the West. The main article, a summary of a lecture given by Prabhupada, was based on the notes taken by Umapati. It has been said that when we wake up and when we go to sleep, we should beat our mind 1,000 times with a shoe. When the mind says things like, why sing Hare Krishna, why not take LSD, we should beat it with the same shoe. However, if we always think of Krishna, no beating will be necessary. The mind will be our best friend. And there was an article by Hayagriva, Flip Out and Stay. Hayagriva has quoted liberally from Hart Crane and Walt Whitman. No wonder so many young collegiates are trying to flip out permanently on super drugs. Perhaps this is their way of saying, we don't want any part of this hell you have made for yourselves. So they use psychedelics as a springboard to propel themselves into different realms, but the drug flip is only temporary. It is temporary because it is artificial. One really begins to wonder where all these trips are leading. Hayagriva concluded that Krishna Kirtana is the quickest way to flip out without coming down. Your associates will think you mad. That is the first sign of progress. Just let others be mad for Maya, the old ephemeral lures of woman and gold. But you be mad instead for the reality. In the back of magazine was an ad for Swamiji's essays, Krishna, the reservoir of pleasure, and who is crazy, and a notice, soon to be printed, Gita Upanishad or Bhagavad Gita as it is, translated and with commentaries by Swami Bhaktivedanta. Prabhupada first and first and main instruction to his editors had been that they should produce the magazine regularly every month. Even if they didn't know what to sell the copies, how to sell the copies, or even if they were only turned out 2 pages, they had to continue bearing the standard. He called Hayagriva to his room and presented him a complete 3-volume set of his Srimad Bhagavatam. On the front page of each volume, he had written, to Sriman Hayagriva Das Brahmachari, with my blessings, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. Hayagriva was grateful and mentioned that he had not been able to afford them. That's all right, Prabhupada said. Now you compile this Back to Godhead, work sincerely, and make it as big as Times Magazine. Prabhupada wanted all his disciples to take part in it. Don't be dull, he said. Write something. He wanted to give his disciples Back to Godhead for their own preaching. Brahmananda and Gargamuni took the first issues out that same night on bicycles, riding to every head shop on the Lower East Side, all the way to 14th Street and as far west as the West Village, until they had distributed all 100 issues. This was an increase in the preaching. Now all his students could take part in the work, typing, editing, writing, assembling, selling. It was his preaching, of course, but he wasn't alone anymore. Over a short 4 months, the society had expanded sufficiently to warrant larger quarters than the small Second Avenue storefront temple, stated the editorial in the second issue of Back to Godhead. Prabhupada had not abandoned his idea for a big building in New York City. Greenwich Village real estate was too expensive and Midtown was out of the question. But Prabhupada still said he wanted to buy a building. It was difficult for his followers to think of Krishna consciousness as anything more than a Lower East Side movement, because who but the people of the Lower East Side would be interested in Krishna consciousness? And anyway, who had money to buy a building in Manhattan? But one day, Ravindra Swarup had happened to meet someone, a wealthy Jewish heir who was sympathetic toward youth movements, who agreed to loan Swamiji $5,000. Ravindra Swarup had arranged the loan, and Swamiji had designated the money as his building fund, to which he had gradually added another $5,000 that he had collected through incidental donations. But with the suitable buildings starting at $100,000, even this sum seemed petty. Swamiji went with Brahmananda to look at the building on 6th Street that had previously been the Jewish Providential Bank. It had a large lobby and a mezzanine, marble floors, and the atmosphere of the temple. Brahmananda suggested that the vault area could be remodeled for use as a dormitory, and Swamiji considered the mezzanine for his own apartment. The large lobby, he said, could be used for kirtans and lectures. On leaving the building, however, Prabhupada noted that it was located on the corner by a bus stop. It would not be a good location. The Gaudiya Math branch at Bhag Bazaar in Calcutta, he said, was also located at a bus stop, and the noisy engines of the buses as they started up created a disturbance. Prabhupada next looked at a temple, Emmanuel, also on the 6th Street on the Lower East Side. It was even larger than the bank building. And when some of the Swamiji's disciples walked through the cavernous, empty rooms, they became bewildered to think how, even if they could get such a place, they would be able to manage or use it. He visited other places, one so neglected and in such poor repair that it looked as though it had been vandalized, and another in similar condition filled the lumber stacked almost to the ceiling. Swamiji asked Rupananda, who had accompanied him, what he thought, and Rupananda said, too much time and money to fix it up. So they left. Swamiji returned to his room and went into the bathroom, where he washed his feet in the tub. He said that it was an Indian custom that after walking outside, you wash your feet. Then the devotees met Mr. Prince, an elegantly dressed real estate agent. You have a handful of stars, Mr. Prince told Brahmananda. You are incorporated as a tax-free religious organization. You have no idea how much money this will save. So many people have to vacate just because they can't pay their taxes. But someone up there is looking after you people, and I have just the place for you and your Swami. Mr. Price showed Brahmananda a handsome three-story building near St. Mark's Place. It was a good downtown location near the young people, yet in an area where the uptown people would feel safe. The floors were polished hardwood, all the doors were ornately handcrafted, and it had a large hall suitable for a temple. The Marquis de Lafayette had stayed here during his visit in 1824, a fact that added to the building's charm and prestige. One evening, Mr. Price visited Prabhupada up in his room. Prabhupada sitting on the floor behind his desk, and Mr. Price sitting in a metal folding chair. Mr. Price wore an elegant suit and a white dress shirt with cuff links and starched cuffs. His expensive dress, meticulously tanned face, and blonde hair, which some devotees thought was a wig, contrasted strangely with the Swamiji's simplicity. Mr. Price kept to Swamiji as Your Excellency, and he expressed much appreciation of Swamiji's work. He spoke optimally about how Through his connections, he hoped to save Prabhupada a lot of money and trouble and get him just the place he wanted. Accompanied by a few disciples, Prabhupada went with Mr. Price to see the building. While Mr. Price, the devotees, and the custodian of the house were all talking together in a group, Prabhupada wandered off unnoticed to a corner of the room where there was an old-fashioned sewing machine. He began pressing the treadle and examining the workings of the machine. As Prabhupada rejoined the group, Mr. Price said, "If you can just get $5,000 down, I can get the owners to draw up a contract. $5,000 down and another 5,000 within 2 months. That shouldn't be so difficult." Prabhupada liked the building and told Brahmananda they should purchase it. Brahmananda was inclined to turn the money over right away, but Prabhupada said that first a suitable contract had to be drawn up. Mr. Price talked to the devotee in private, speaking in the Swami's interest and in the interest of spiritual movement, and he seemed to be promising them something even more than a contract. Perhaps he would give them the building. It didn't make sense that he could give the building, but he told them something like that. He wanted the devotees to think of him as their friend, and he invited them over to his house one evening. When the devotees gathered in his house, sitting stiffly on chairs in his living room, which was lined with bookcases filled not with books but with two-dimensional designs depicting rows of books, he continued to flatter them. He praised Hayagriva's writing, and Hayagriva was obviously embarrassed and flattered. He praised everything about the devotees. He also spoke of how his dog had recently died and said, "The house seems empty without the little fellow." He was an unusual man, effeminate and full of flattery and praises. Prabhupada remained reserved after his first meeting with Mr. Price, though he was interested in getting the building if proper arrangement could be made. Brahmananda continued to negotiate with Mr. Price, and soon, according to Mr. Price, the owners of the building would be expecting the devotees to give proof of their ability to meet the payments. On Prabhupada direction, the devotees hired a lawyer to go over the contract. "This Mr. Price is causing us so much pain," Prabhupada said. "What is the difficulty?" He didn't see the necessity for Mr. Price at all. "Why don't we purchase directly from the owner? Why all these agents? It's just the way it's done here," Brahmananda said. Alan Kalman was a record producer. He had read the article in the East Village over other about the Swami from India and the mantra he had brought with him. When he had read the Hare Krishna mantra on the front page, he had become attracted. The article gave the idea that one could get a tremendous high or ecstasy from the chanting. The Swami's Second Avenue address was given in the article. So one night in the November, Alan and his wife visited the storefront. Alan, there were about 30 pairs of shoes in the back of the room, people in the front and the shoes in the back. We took off our shoes and sat down. Everyone was seated and very quiet. Front and center was a chair, and everyone was staring at this chair. Even then, we felt a certain energy in the room. No one was saying anything, and everyone was staring at the chair. The next thing was our first sight of the Swami. He came in and sat down on the chair, and there was a tremendous surge of energy. The Swami began chanting, and it was very beautiful sound. Swamiji had this little drum he was hitting, very penetrating and exciting. One of the devotees was holding up a sign with a chant written on it so everyone could follow. Then the devotees got up and danced in a circle, a special dance with steps to it. The Swami was looking around the room, and he seemed to smile as he looked at you, as if to encourage you to join. The next day, Alan phoned Prabhupada to propose that he make a record of the chanting. But it was Brahmananda who answered the phone, and he gave Alan an appointment with the Swami that evening. So again, Alan and his wife went down to East Village, which to them was the neighborhood where things were happening. If you wanted to have some excitement, you went down to the East Village. When they entered the Swami's room, he was seated at his typewriter working. As soon as Alan mentioned his idea about making a record, Prabhupada was interested. Yes, he said, we must record. If you will help us distribute the chanting of Hare Krishna, then it is our duty. They scheduled the recording for 2 weeks later in December at Adelphi Recording Studio near Times Square. Alan's wife was impressed by how enthusiastically the Swami had gotten to the point of making the record. He had so much energy and ambition in his plans. It was the night before the recording date. A boy walked into the storefront for the evening kirtan carrying a large two-headed Indian drum. This was not unusual, as guests often brought drums, flutes, and other instruments. Yet this time, Swamiji seemed particularly interested. The boy sat down and was preparing to play when Prabhupada motioned for the boy to bring him the drum. The boy didn't move. He wanted to play it himself, but Brahmananda went over and said, Swamiji wants to play the drum. So the boy gave it. Brahmananda. Swamiji began to play and his hands were just dancing on the drum. Everyone was stunned that Swamiji knew how to do it. All we had seen was the bongo drum. So I thought it was the proper Indian drum. But when this two-headed drum came out of nowhere and the Swamiji started playing it like a master musician, it created an ecstasy 100 times more than bongo drum had. After the kirtan, Prabhupada asked the boy if he could borrow the drum for the recording session the next night. The boy at first was reluctant, but the devotees promised to return his drum the next day. So he agreed and said he would bring the drum the next evening. When he left the storefront that night with his drum under his arm, the devotees thought they would never see the boy or his drum again. But the next day, a few hours before Swamiji was to leave for the studio, the boy returned with his drum. It was a cold December night. The Swami, dressed in his usual saffron dhoti, a tweed overcoat, and a pair of grey shoes, which had long since replaced his original white pointy rubber ones, got into Rupanuga's Volkswagen van with about 15 of his followers and their instruments and started for the recording studio. I'll stop here. Śrīla Prabhupada ki jai, His Holiness Satsvarupa Goswami Maharaj ki jai. Hare Krishna. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Prabhuji.
Was there a proper connection? We are not at home. We are outside.
Yes, Prabhuji. It was clear.